GABL, brought to you by Tozix.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Don.
We're back again with another episode. Today, we're going to be talking about some aviation, and we're going to go into a few specifics. What do we got, Don?
We are going to be talking about air traffic control.
Oh, Sam.
And it's a subject that's not explored very often, which I guess would keep with our theme of common subjects that are uncommonly talked about. But you hear a lot, you know that they're there, but you don't really read or hear a whole lot about air traffic control.
Right.
And so we're going to dive deep into this. And I think probably the best way to get started is to go into a little bit of the systems and the process of how air traffic control works. Then let's talk a little bit about the history, and then we can dive into the actual nuts and bolts of some of the great things that they have done.
Perfect. Sounds great to me. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of research on this, and it is really interesting. Really technical. A lot more technical than I thought it was going to be.
Yes.
I was hoping it would be more fun. But actually, I found some great stories, too. So stick around towards the end of the episode. We're going to share some great aviation stories.
Yes, and there is a lot of neat stories, and it is very technical. So as you listen today, we will try to stay out of the weeds. However, we do kind of have to wind our way through some of this. And so it's very unique, interesting, and this industry has so many regulations and so many different things that they're a part of. But from my research, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from my research, I found that there's basically 4 different branches or control levels of air traffic control. So you have the ground control. Ground control is basically in charge of all ground ops. They're usually
right.
So they're located.
They operate off the local tower of that station. Yes.
Yes, and they're located generally in the flight tower.
Right.
And but ground ops controls all like the parking the planes and then sequencing them.
Whether they can taxi or not, taxi out to which runway. Taxi. Oh, you're clear to taxi out to runway Alpha.
Yes, and
right.
then once they get, so the second division is called local control, or the tower. And local control, or the tower, they are in charge of departures and arrivals. They're also located in the tall tower that you see at airports. Mm-hmm. And they're, from my understanding, correct me if you found different research, but from my research, they basically have control of that airplane for departures and arrivals within 7 to 10 miles of the airport.
Yeah. Another rule of thumb is they would say is if you can see it, they have to be in contact with it and control of it and keep everybody. But they also control it before they're in line of sight in most cases.
Okay, and the other interesting part about it too is each runway, and I didn't know this until I researched it.
I said in control. I should have said responsible for.
Responsible.
Yes.
That's a good word. I didn't realize this, but each runway has its own controller. So for busy airports.
Yeah, like JFK or something.
JFK. So every runway is going to have its own local flight controller.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I did know. When I listened to the air traffic, I've been listening to it just as the research, and it's really interesting how they hand off to another guy. Like, okay, no, you're going to go on frequency 1412. Roger that. And then they'll just change, and they'll just hand off to another flight controller.
Yes.
And that makes sense. If they're going to runway Charlie, they would hand them off to another flight controller that's in charge
who's
of
in charge of runway Charlie.
Yeah.
And so ground control hands them off to the person that's in charge of that runway. And then once it gets in the air and it's 7 to 10 miles out, then they hand it off to a division called TRACON. And TRACON is they have responsibility for the flights up to 12 to 14,000 feet. And it's basically after they're no longer in line of sight of the airport, this TRACON takes over.
Right.
And all major airports have a TRACON as well. Mm-hmm. And so
And then they enter like beyond that. How many levels are there? You said
4.
So that was 3, and then the
Yes.
4th one is like international airspace. Is that right?
Well, kind of. Yeah, they call it the center.
Okay, the
And,
center, and then different nations are responsible for different quadrants.
Yes, exactly. So there's several centers around the world, and each is responsible for a defined airspace. And so let's say I'm flying from Chicago to LA. As I'm flying, I'm going to be handled by ground control. They're going to tell me to back away from the
give
deal.
you the taxi instructions,
Tell me
runway instructions.
Go runway to, like you said, Charlie Bravo 19. So I'll get over to that. Then they hand me off to the tower. The tower takes me, gets me into the air. Once I get into the air, I go up to 12 to 14,000 feet. They hand me off to TRACON. TRACON takes me up to higher than 12,000 feet. And then, TRACON takes me up to 12,000 feet. Then the center takes me higher than that. And then each center will pass me off. So let's say I'm in Chicago. Chicago will then pass me off to Dallas, and then Dallas will pass me off to Phoenix, and then Phoenix will pass me off to San Francisco, et cetera.
And it's interesting to see how the pilot has to get permission every step of the way. So he'll say he's not clear for takeoff. He's not even cleared to taxi out, right? He has to clear from taxi out from the first people, and then he also has to get cleared for takeoff, do his pre-flight checklist, and then the pre or after startup checklist, and then after flight checklist. There's like 3 checklists they have to go through, the pilot and his crew. And once they take off, then they have to request permission to ascend to their traveling altitude. Like they'll say permission for flight 340, and that means I want to fly at 3,400 or 34,000 feet.
Yes, cleared for
and then they'll say you're clear for flight
Reading 528. Cleared for exactly.
Yeah.
Their language.
It's so quick.
It is so fast. In fact, I was listening like you were. I was listening to quite a bit of air traffic control traffic and the audio, and one of them is actually hilarious because the guy is just talking super slow, and the air traffic controller says, "You're gonna have to speed up. I got a lot of planes in the air," or something like that. I mean, it was like, "You're talking too slow. Come on, speed it up. It's time to go."
Yeah, I listened to a compilation of funny ones, and there are some pretty good ones out there. There was one, I think it was on JFK, because I mentioned JFK earlier. It was a compilation of all the funny calls on JFK. And it was just really funny. One pilot says, "Can't land there. There's a beanbag chair on the runway." And then the air traffic control says, "Did you say beanbag chair?" And then they read it out to everybody. Everybody be on the lookout for a beanbag chair on runway Charlie. Going to have to suspend that till we get the cleanup crew out there.
Yeah, that's great. And what's amazing about all that, too, is we could go into flight ops, and we do have an episode coming up here soon where we're going to talk a little more about planes and some of the interesting ways that they work. But one of the neat things about these runways is they can't even have like a nut or a bolt laying there. The engines will pick it up. It'll damage the engine.
Well, that one incident where that commercial airliner took off, a very large airliner, and landing gear wouldn't retract. And so they had to fly by to San Luis Obispo to do a visual. So they flew real low so the other air traffic controller could get a visual look at it, and they saw that his landing gear was twisted sideways. So it wouldn't straighten out to be tucked under, actually. And so he couldn't land or he couldn't retract the land gear. So they eventually just told him, "You're going to have to land." So they had him fly around to burn off the excess fuel. So he had a lot less fuel from his front tanks. He specifically drained the fuel all the way from the front. So he'd only have fuel in the back to have more weight in the back.
More weight in the back. So when
less
he
weight
landed,
on that
less
front
weight on
landing
that front.
gear.
Wow.
That was tweaked.
That's pretty awesome. So now this is an interesting part of the research.
They landed and they survived. It's pretty incredible. The landing gear, the tires smoked and just melted away. It's like a rim. Half the rim was sheared off from the friction.
Force. Wow. And now,
but everybody lived.
Everybody lived. Did it end up crumpling and the nose?
No, it held sturdy. It just got looked like you took it to a bench grinder or something and just grinded it away. And it was so perfectly sheared off. There's like a picture at the end when it's done, and you can look at the photograph and you'll see that it looks like a car rim, but it's completely flat in the bottom.
Cut in half. Wow. So that shows you the amount of pressure that these landing gear, and when you think about it, the amount of force and power. I mean, every time I've seen a plane land, when you watch it land, the tires, as soon as they hit, the tires smoke and all of that. So to think about the absolute force that those gear, the structure of them, has to be amazing.
Right.
So,
Well, that, and remember the aircraft carrier episode, they have to be able to withstand that catapult.
yes.
That launches them from 0 to 176 miles an hour in what was it, like a second and a half?
Yeah,
it was
something like that. Yeah,
crazy.
1.3 seconds or something. Yeah. Now, this is an interesting part of my research, and that is obviously these centers and air traffic control, TRACON, all these places, they use, their tools is radar. It's a big part of it. And then they're using computers, obviously. They're using actual maps. But what's amazing to me was they're still using many systems that were invented in World War II.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so
The research I did looked really modern. The computers were figuring out most of it, and then they had to make sure someone entered like your jurisdiction
Yes.
at the right altitude, at the right speed, and then when they left your responsibility, your jurisdiction, they had to be at the assigned altitude or speed. And then you had to radio ahead and say, "Hey, I'm clearing Malaysia 522 going into your airspace." And then they let you know that they received the message. Roger that.
Roger, 528,
Flight
yes.
level 35 or 350. And then they say, "Oh, Roger that." And then they know at what altitude and what speed is an aircraft coming into my airspace. But before that even happens, there's already a flight plan, and everybody receives a copy of the flight plan. And the thing that I found interesting was when an airspace is shut down or when someone's charging extra for their airspace, certain
Yes.
countries will have rates that go up and down, and
Yes.
they'll charge more rates to use their airspace. And sometimes airlines will go around the airspace that's charging a lot of money.
so they don't have to pay that
Yes,
exorbitant
they'll
price.
pay the extra fuel and not pay to rent the airspace. Or some cases, like there's like tension or political issues where it's a no-fly area.
or if you have Air Force bases or different bases or different things like that.
Yeah, sometimes in weather, of course. There's all
Yes.
sorts of reasons to take alternate routes.
Now, up until the 90s, they were still using pieces of paper. So they still had radar. They had computers, but they would every plane had a slip of paper, and as it changed specific
Like
altitudes,
flight routes and alternate
all of
routes?
that, there was like an assistant from my research. There would be an assistant for every controller, and they would basically be updating, handing slips of paper regarding that flight. So I can't even imagine trying to keep track of all the papers. It's amazing. More planes didn't get lost. More things didn't happen. Just as it's changing altitude, A528. Here we go. We have a Cessna 528, which that's another interesting thing. They don't say like 528. They take the last three numbers of the flight number of the plane, and then they take whatever like if it's Delta or if it's whatever carrier it is, they each have these little like KLM or
Yeah, or I've seen they've even been assigned nicknames.
yes.
And the nicknames
So-
are hard to follow too, because they'll
Okay,
be calling it one thing until you assign yourself a nickname. Then
So
you're
the nickname, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong on this, but I think the nicknames are not for the planes. The nickname is the nickname that is assigned to the pilot. So pilots have their own nicknames, and then flights have
Whoa,
their own
no,
nicknames.
I didn't even see that.
Yeah,
man, I spent
So I was
days on this.
actually researching flight talk basically, and it's where learn basically how you learn how to talk like a pilot, and they were mentioning that. So,
Well,
but
neat. So, do you have more technical stuff, or are we going to get into a story? What do we got?
I think what's really this was interesting for me. Not only is the systems up until the 90s used that were still World War II, but weather obviously is so critical, as you've already mentioned.
Yeah.
And so each one of these centers that we talked about before gets a weather briefing. All the employees get a weather
every
briefing
morning, that's right.
before each shift. And then each center also has a national weather employee on hand for every shift.
Right. Yeah,
And
it's really.
But when
That
you think
sounds-
about the coordination of all that,
Yeah, could you imagine every day you're in a meeting and it says, "Okay, we got rain and we got maybe some crosswinds," and you're thinking, "Okay, rain, crosswind," taking notes to instruct your pilots later on.
yes.
Look out for some turbulence around flight level 240. And so
Yeah. Okay, now this is just a trivia question. We always have a trivia question usually in our episodes. But do you have any idea how much air traffic there would be per day into some of the nation's busier airports.
Air traffic per day in some busier airports. So maybe O'Hare is a large airport.
Yes, or Atlanta. Atlanta is the highest traffic.
Okay.
So
how many airplanes?
how many aircraft, yes, come in,
Oh, I'm going to say...
land or take off from these airports per
Let's
day?
think. If it has like... How many runways does it have? Can you tell me that? 8?
That I don't know.
Okay.
Because it would vary.
So you can land a plane about every 30 minutes. I'm going to say every day, let's go with 1,000.
Good guess. That's a good guess, but super low.
Oh, 10,000.
No, that's super high.
Okay.
So they land between 2,500 and 3,200 aircraft per day.
Whoa.
So Atlanta,
No wonder they say it's so stressful.
it's super
You have
stressful.
to make sure all the planes are maintaining proper distance from each other.
You're landing one flight every 30 seconds.
Wow.
Every 30 seconds, there's a flight leaving or departing or arriving. So now you were talking about maintaining distance and stuff. Talk a little bit
there's
about that.
There's a lot
please.
of rules they have to keep in mind. So not only are they doing air traffic control, or while they're doing air traffic control, there's all these rules they have to abide by because they get rerouted so often. If someone has turbulence or if someone has an issue, they can't make that ascent in the correct time. You have to reroute them and then reroute everyone else so they don't go within 5 miles of them horizontally or 1,000 feet vertically from them. You have to draw all these predictions in your mind. Okay, this guy's this far out. I'm going to tell him to reduce his speed so I can get this plane landed, and they will never be within 5 miles of each other. So you're constantly updating different airliners to go at different speeds, make different maneuvers so you can make sure everybody's properly spaced apart. Mm-hmm. And I've listened to some air traffic, and sometimes they get into arguments. The pilot will say, well, I have really low fuel, and then the air traffic controller says, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. I got 2 people ahead of you. How low are you? Oh, 2,100 pounds. And sir, you have plenty of fuel. It's just funny to hear him argue.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that took place.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that either until I started listening to it. But there is definite, not just arguments, but I guess it's like every other job. You have pilots or air traffic controllers that have bad days, and so they're snapping at each other. Or maybe somebody says something and everybody else laughs, and it's there's definitely some interaction with it.
So something you hear about a lot is like, let's say the pilot has a heart attack or he somehow becomes incapacitated, mm-hmm. and then someone else flies and lands the plane. How often do you think that has happened on a commercial basis, like a very large commercial airliner?
I would guess under 10 times.
Under 10 times. Yeah. That's a great guess. I thought it would happen a lot more than it actually has. But according to my research, it's only happened once.
One time. Oh, wow. Okay.
It's really crazy. So it has happened with smaller planes, like mm-hmm. little Cessnas, little dual prop planes. But as far as I can find, as far as a commercial jet airliner, it's happened once. So on August 14th, 2005, a Helios Airway flight, you probably haven't heard of them because they are no longer around.
Okay.
Helios
Is there a
Airway
reason
flight
why they're no longer
522.
around? Anyway, sorry.
It may be because of this incident, but they shut down several years after this, so maybe not.
Okay.
But who knows?
Roger 528.
So what happened is these pilots are together. One is about 60 years old. One is 40. Together, they have combined experience of over 20,000 hours of flight time. And they go to take off. Well, they don't go to take off. They actually get approval. They do their pre-flight checklist, their after-startup checklist, and then they take off and do their flight checklist, 3 checklists.
Okay.
Once they get to about 10,000 feet, an alarm goes off. And they think it's the alarm for the pre-flight ignition.
Okay.
There's an alarm that goes off if you don't have your pre-flight configuration set correctly, mm-hmm. and it'll say, hey, your pre-flight configuration is not set correctly. So they try to figure it out, but they are from 2 different nations, and they have kind of a language barrier. They do speak the same language, but not extremely well. So they go back and forth for about 2.5 minutes. They finally radio the control tower and say, listen, we have this alarm going off that's saying we have a pre-flight configuration error. What's going on? So the air traffic control doesn't know, so they say, let me get an engineer. A couple more minutes go by. Now, these guys are ascending they already had been cleared to go to flight level 340, so 34,000 feet.
Okay.
They have autopilot set to ascend to 34,000 feet and then level off, which autopilot can do. So they're
Yes.
not even on the yoke.
Okay.
Right?
Which would be the controls.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So they're not controlling the rate of ascension themselves. It's on autopilot. So now they're just waiting for the engineer to get back to them. And then another alarm goes off when they get about 18,000 feet.
Okay.
And the pilot says, okay, it looks like something to do with my cooling fans. Where's the cooling fan circuit breaker? And they're asking questions. The engineer says, sir, have you looked at the cabin pressurization? Make sure it's set to auto, not manual. The pilot ignores the question and then asks him again, hey, where's my circuit controls for the cooling fans? Because he's seen another light up that's saying that there's inadequate cooling to their instruments.
Oh, okay. So he's afraid he's going to lose all of his instruments.
Yes, at this point, we think the pilot gets up, goes behind the seat to reset the breakers, but he never replies to the radio tower.
From that point on?
Yes.
Okay.
And they've only been in flight a few minutes, but they are about 18,000 feet. What had happened is a couple days, or that day before that plane flew, there was a noise on one of the doors, and they thought it was a leak. They wrote up a report and had an engineer go out and check it. The engineer did a pressure test on it, and according to the official incident report, that pressure check might not have been 100% accurate or adequate. Anyway, he did a pressure check, gave it, the airplane's good to go. They took off again, and what he did is he switched the cabin pressure control that regulates the air cabin pressure from auto to manual.
Oh, no.
So the cab was not pressurizing as they went up into altitude. When you go up in the altitude, the air gets thinner.
Yes.
And there's not enough oxygen to keep you awake and conscious and thinking clearly. So as soon as they hit that 18,000 mile mark, there wasn't enough oxygen for their brains to function properly. And that's why the pilot never responded to the call.
Wow.
The plane goes ahead and ascends on autopilot to flight level 340 or 34,000 feet, levels off, and at that point they scramble two F-16 jet fighters to intercept the plane to give them direction, see why they're not responding to their call. One gets behind the plane, one pulls up beside the plane and looks over at the pilot, doesn't see the pilot in the pilot seat. He sees the co-pilot. He is unconscious, kind of slouched over in his little harness there. He radios back and says, hey, listen, these guys are unconscious. I'm going to look at the rest of the plane. He pulls off a little bit to look at the passengers, and he notices all the passengers are unconscious as well, and the masks are dangling down. He's watching, and he realizes there's one guy who makes his way who's still awake, and this is 3 hours into the flight. There's a gentleman who was awake and walking around the plane, and he gets into the pilot seat and tries to pilot the plane. The jet fighter's waving at the guy saying, hey, trying to give him hand signals to say, follow me to the airport.
Yeah.
But the guy in the pilot seat just points to the ground.
Oh, wow.
And then the plane slowly goes down and lower, and then crashes, and all 121 people died.
Oh, my goodness. What's amazing about that, too, and this is outside of my research because I had something else, but that sounds very similar. Have you ever heard of a golfer by the name of Payne Stewart?
No.
So Payne Stewart,
Well,
he was a...
before we move on to that story,
Yeah.
this story is pretty crazy because number one, hypoxia. Hypoxia is when you don't get enough oxygen, you don't think clearly. There is a crazy amount of interesting things about this because at 13,000 feet, it takes several minutes. So let's say 30 minutes before you lose useful consciousness is what they call it. They call it TUC, time of useful consciousness. As you get up to higher altitudes, it's only about 60 seconds, 30 seconds. Once you're at flight level 450 or 400, then it's only like 9 seconds. So what was interesting is how this guy was awake 3 hours later because the oxygen masks only last 12 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So all those oxygen masks that dropped down only kept people alive and coherent for about 12 more minutes. Then they were all unconscious. Their hearts are probably still beating, but there wasn't enough oxygen to have them be coherent.
Well,
Now this guy found 4 spare oxygen tanks, and he's a scuba diver. So he goes and grabs the oxygen tanks, and they found all 4 oxygen tanks in the cockpit.
wow. So he was grabbing them and using them
Yes.
to stay oxygenated.
So those are the facts of the case. What happened is it was set to manual, not automatic. The pilots mistook the alarm for the pre-flight configuration alarm, but it was actually the cabin pressurization alarm. So they misdiagnosed the alarm, therefore they didn't correct for it.
Wow. Okay.
And they said they should have retarded the throttle and leveled off and figured out what was going on, why the alarm was going off before they ascended, but they just left it ascending. And the pilots did both have a history of not following procedure in the past. They had documented of not following procedure before.
So what became of this?
Well, one thing is the FAA required that there be different alarms for these different things, the pre-flight configuration, and then the pressurization in the cab. It had to be sound like different alarms because a pilot would hear that first alarm a lot. If something wasn't quite right, you would hear that. It's pretty normal for takeoff. I spun up one engine, didn't wait in time. Okay, that makes sense.
So you kind of dismiss it in a way.
You got used to that sound. And that sound should never be on when you're in flight. It's just on the ground as you're starting up your engine sound.
Got it. So basically, the FAA said, you're going to make two different sounds. So when you hear this one, it's an emergency.
But what's crazy is the FAA didn't actually get around to doing that until like 5 years later in 2000, or 6 years later, 2011. Wow. And then they finally had it fully implemented in 2014.
Oh, interesting. So while you were talking about that, I just pulled up on the studio laptop and realized that story is almost exactly like this golfer that I remember hearing about, Payne Stewart, and he was a championship PGA golfer, and his Learjet, they were flying, and the same thing, they got hypoxia, although it's never been determined exactly why their in-flight pressurization system shut down. But the same kind of thing, they actually had 3 different times. They had one intercept from one deal, and they just kind of concluded that we didn't see any flight movement. Then they had a second interception, and kind of the same thing, and a third interception. Finally, they were headed towards Canada, and Canada says, if they fly into our airspace, we're shooting them down.
Oh.
And they ended up crashing, and it killed everybody on board. But that while you were talking about that, that was very interesting because I remember hearing that story and thinking, wow, losing pressure in the.
Well, what's weird, this is where the speculation comes in on that story, is that guy, his girlfriend was on board. So people speculate that he saw his girlfriend die and he wasn't able to save her because he only had the one mask that fit the reserve oxygen tanks. So they think the reason he pointed down.
He just gonna.
But that's a long hypothesis because you have to say, first of all, he understood that the pilot was telling him to come to an airport and then pointed down, no, I'm going down.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was just because the engine had run out of fuel and he knew he wasn't going to make it to an airport. But they speculated, no, he lost his girlfriend, he lost all hope, and he wanted to crash. We'll never know.
We'll never know, yeah.
But it's a crazy story. The only time that I can find where someone who was not the pilot or co-pilot took over a commercial airliner in flight and tried to land it.
Other than September 11th.
Now, this guy was a pilot. He was a commercial pilot, in fact, but he was not approved or certified to run a 737. And a 737 is a massive plane.
It is a massive plane.
Wasn't it the biggest for a long time?
It was.
The largest passenger plane.
Yeah.
So they're enormous and very technical, a lot of things. And the instruments are going to look very different from plane to plane, largely dependent on their size.
Yes, true. Now, in my research, I came across an incredible story. Of course, we're talking about air traffic control and all the things that they play a role in. And so there was this is pretty neat. There was a flight that was flying, basically they fly over the North Pole. And so they fly a lot over Alaska and into that area. And so as they were flying, this guy lost his gyroscope. And he completely had no bearing where he was at, where he was going, what he was doing. And so as he was
just flying by visual?
He was just flying by visual, and then it got dark on him.
Oh, no.
And so he has no way to really figure out where to go, how to go, what to do.
Sun.
And so he starts talking to air traffic control. Air traffic control starts trying to guide him, but how do you guide him without a gyroscope? And
if you're over water too, it is extremely hard to know how fast you're moving, to know what direction you're headed.
So he was actually over land, but he was near Greenland, and so while he was flying, they were lost.
So he was over Alaska, and then he made it all the way to Greenland?
I believe so.
Okay.
And so his compass was useless. and the magnetic North Pole is actually southwest of where he was, about 1,000 miles. And so he was traveling, and as he's traveling, he's basically when the crew drifted off, they spoke like, hey, we're going to bail out. We have this much fuel and everything, and and this air traffic controller said, that's a bad idea. You're going to freeze to death. It's freezing up here. You will not survive if you bail out of this plane. So he said, do not bail out unless the airplane is on fire. So, but he also knew that the Air Force was building a powerful radar station. It was only halfway completed. And these lines, these electric lines kind of, that were going to run the radar were just stretched out, all laying on the permafrost.
Oh, okay.
And so he made some calls, and he was like, hey, do you think you could get those wires working? And so they said, we can try. And so they weren't even on telephone poles, but they got this crank system out, and they're cranking it, and it caused all those lines that were laying on the ground to start working. And so then he reached out to these technicians, and they got in their Jeeps, and they went and they fired up that radar. And then as they fired up the radar, so now they're kind of able to guide this plane. They've picked it up on radar now. We know where you're at. They guide them into the nearest runway. But then they realized that because of the weather conditions and the night and all of that, the sun had set, the sky was overcast, and there was no working lights. So
on the runway.
On the runway.
Lights.
So the 10,000-foot runway was good for day landings only. But there was a ton of work trucks all over the place. So they put the call out to base operations, and the base operations officer called all these guys, said, go get in your trucks, drive them out to the runway, point them at the runway, and we're going to light it up with truck lights.
Wow.
So they pointed all these trucks at the runway, and they made it to where this airplane landed successfully due to truck lights and radar lines that were laying on the ground.
A quickly thrown together radar tracking system. That's
but it
amazing.
shows you how fast thinking these guys had to be. And but he saved their lives. So
that's really, really incredible. Okay, I got another story here. Easter Sunday, 2009, a 56-year-old man, his name is Doug White. Him and his wife and two daughters.
I know a Doug White. I wonder if it's the same one. Probably not.
Probably
Anyways.
not. One daughter's 18 at the time, and one daughter is a baby. So they went to their Doug's brother's funeral.
Okay.
His younger brother had passed away, so they go down from Louisiana down to Florida for the funeral, and on their way back, they chartered a flight to fly home. And this is when they fly on a Sky King B-200.
Okay.
Their pilot is a retired colonel from the Air Force. His name is Joe Klavick. He was the pilot, and he had flown F-100s in Vietnam, and he had 20 years experience of flying charter planes. So this guy's super experienced, getting a little older, but he's doing great. Now, Doug, the gentleman that went to his younger brother's funeral, the passenger, he had flown, he had got his pilot's certificate, not his pilot's license, in 1991. He logged about, some sources say 80 hours. The most I found is 230 hours of flight time. And once he got his pilot's certificate, he quit flying around 1992, 1991.
Okay.
And this took place in 2009, so it's much, much later. But he's still really curious about planes. He loves aviation. So he asked the pilot, Mr. retired Colonel Joe Klavick, if, hey, can I ride in the co-pilot seat? And Joe said, of course. So his wife and his two daughters are in the back, and they take off. Everything seems fine. Retired Colonel Joe Klavick radios in and says, listen, this is my flight level, approved for this. He gets approval. And then Joe kind of gets a little weird, gets real quiet. And so Doug's not sure what's going on. So he's asking about the plane. Hey, how do you use the radio? Oh, it's that button right there on the yoke there. And then Joe Klavick puts his head down, makes a weird gurgling noise, and then becomes non-responsive.
Oh, no.
So Doug is frantic. He's on the radio calling and say, hey, I'm in an Air King B-200. I need help. I don't know. My pilot's unconscious. I'm in the co-pilot seat. Does anybody hear me? And he's calling out and calling out. So finally the traffic control gets on and says, sir, what's going on? He says, this is what's going on. He's passed out. I don't know what's going on. I need help. I don't know how to fly this thing. I've flown a Cessna 172.
which is totally different.
Yeah, several years ago, and I don't know anything about this thing. And it was a completely different aircraft. They're so different. In fact, a Cessna 172 is a single engine, really lightweight plane, and this thing is big and heavy, dual engine, different controls. Everything looks different, and it has autopilot and all these things the Cessna 172 doesn't have.
So basically, you have to be instrument rated, not just visually rated to fly this thing.
Yeah, and the additional engine and all the weight, there's all these different regulations, and the way you handle the yoke is different. There's all these different reasons why the plane is different. So he's radioing for help. They don't know. The air traffic controller isn't sure what to do. So he's thinking, okay, sir, calm down. It's in autopilot right now. Okay, set the autopilot to a flight level 1100 and just sit there, and I'm going to see what I can do. And later in an interview, the air traffic controller says, I'm trying to be calm talking to Doug, and I'm screaming in the office saying, give me someone in here that knows how to fly one of these things. I need a pilot. He's calm talking to Doug, but otherwise he is not calm. And finally they pull this lady in who was also a pilot, one of the air traffic controllers. She had walked out of the building. They ran out and grabbed her when she was walking out to her car.
Oh my goodness.
And they said, hey, we need you. You're a pilot, right? I said, yeah. So she goes back in and she starts giving Doug step-by-step instructions. Doug, what's going on? He says, the autopilot's on. I set it to a flight level 1100, but I'm at 13,000 feet and I'm still climbing. Okay, go ahead and disengage it. Hold on to the yoke and real gentle. She's like walking through it. There's like a 45-minute recording. You can hear the whole thing. So this story is insane, bro.
Wow.
She's telling him how to handle the plane and how to redirect it. And he's listening to her. Okay, understand. He starts to use some terminology as he gets more comfortable knowing that.
It starts coming back to him a little bit, yeah.
So he's starting to use some of the terminology, using his call sign when he's talking to her, because she refers to him by the plane identification. He uses that when he's speaking.
Okay.
And the really aggravating part about listening to this recording is they get interrupted like 9 times from other airplanes. And the air traffic controller has to keep telling them, go to 141.2, get off this channel. I'm working with an emergency. And he had to keep directing these other pilots to get off her channel.
So it's like they weren't even listening, weren't paying one bit
Some
of
of them
attention.
were not listening, and they wanted, hey, you're the traffic controller, I want to land, but they were being redirected and told to go around. They didn't like that. So anyway, about several minutes into this, Doug is having a really hard time holding the plane steady. Finally, they realize the pilot is leaning on the trim, so it's full up on the trim.
Oh, so it's causing
So he's
it to go
fighting the trim to keep it level, and then they finally tell him, you have an electronic trim override on your yoke, so he hits that, overrides the trim, and now he's flying easy.
Oh, okay.
So he had no idea electronic trim and a manual trim that the pilot was leaning on. His wife had actually strapped Joe Klavick down a little tighter in his harness so he wouldn't lean on the controls so much.
Oh, okay.
And interfere with the situation. So they walk him through it, and Joe Klavick, Doug White, my goodness, this guy, he is so funny when you listen to him. He's got a really thick Louisiana accent. So he's like, and he gets handed off to the guy that's going to finally land him. They get him directed to an airport. He says, Doug, how you doing? He's like, it's just me and the good Lord flying this thing. And it's just so funny to hear him in his accent. And he says, all right. And they're pulling him in. Okay, I want the flaps down. At what point do I put the flaps down? And they'd have to tell him, okay, you're going to be at 160 knots, no faster than 160 knots. You're going to put the flaps at approach, and then you're going to lower the landing gear. Once you get down to 120 knots, you're going to put the full flaps on, and that's when you start pulling up on the yoke, and you're going to try to land this thing. Now, later on, the air traffic controllers gave him a 5% chance of being successful at this.
Oh, my.
They thought for sure he was going to fail.
Oh, wow.
But he lands it. Not only does he land it, he lands it pretty smoothly. There's pictures and a little video of him landing. It is crazy how he pulls this off on a plane he had no idea how to fly.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And to think that it was the air traffic controller is the one that did it all for him, basically.
Yeah, well, the second air traffic controller that actually landed him, that gentleman did not know how to fly. He had called a pilot on the phone and was kind of relaying, okay, let me check on the flaps, and then he would talk to the pilot on the phone. Okay, flaps at 120, full flaps at 120, and then he relay that to Doug White. Yeah, full flaps at 120. No sooner, no slower than 110 knots because you're going to stall.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank the good Lord that he made it down. Well, I've actually had a little bit of experience. I've flown a Piper with a friend of mine.
Oh, real quick after he landed, he couldn't turn the engines off, and that was a kind of a funny ordeal. They had to tell him how to turn the engines off. He had no idea. He was just happy to land. He has full brakes on, engine still going. They're throttled down, but they're kind of fighting his brakes a little bit until he figured out how to turn them off. And he was quoted saying, there was buzzers, amber lights, horns. It was like a circus. The only thing I was concentrating on was keeping the airspeed and wings level. Just fly the plane, focus your fear, and get into a zone. There's no chit chat or lock up. Just get her done. He said, if you're gonna die, at least try trying not to.
That makes good sense. If you're gonna die trying not to.
Yeah, it's pretty.
I like it. Yeah.
Pretty amazing story.
Well,
so that's way better than the other one where 121 died.
Yeah, there's so many different. There's an interesting story out there, and maybe if you're listening and you like to do a little research on it, there's a story where the windshield of the plane broke and actually sucked the pilot out. It's happened more than once.
Yeah, no, I've read those stories.
Yeah, where they were halfway out of the plane, or maybe a navigator or a flight engineer or somebody was holding them in.
I read an interview for one of the guys that was high up in the FAA, Federal Aviation Admission, and guess how many times windshields break or windscreens on airplane or commercial jetliners?
I have no clue.
He said every week.
Every week.
He says, and sometimes they shatter, but the airlines don't disclose it because they don't want people to fear flying if they knew how frequent it happened.
It happened. Wow.
Every week, just in the United States.
Unreal. Well, I know I've read several accounts of one that happened in Russia. This was back, I want to say in the 80s, maybe the early 90s. And it sucked him out halfway. Just his knees were holding him in.
Whoa.
And he was about to freeze.
Well, and there's no oxygen.
There's no oxygen. And trying to get him down. They finally landed. The guy survived.
Whoa.
There's just so many different stories of things like that. I know.
Yeah, I saw a picture of a guy who the windshield had shattered. It had sucked the pilot out, but his feet caught the yoke, which forced the plane to dive.
To go into a dive. Oh, my goodness.
And then the co-pilot was fighting the pilot because they're doing opposite things on the yoke. I think they even have a yoke override that they tried to do.
Yes.
But then one of the flight crew went out and grabbed onto the pilot's legs and held him until they were able to lower the airspeed, get lower to warmer air, more air, and they were able to pull him back in, and he survived as well.
Unreal. That's just, it's so amazing to me. And yet, all this, while this is all happening, you got air traffic control that's guiding these guys, helping these guys, keeping them calm. It's got to be just an amazingly stressful job. And
well, it's just stressful with all those pilots kind of arguing with you, and you have to keep them on a certain distance. There's all these rules,
rules and knowing where they're at, and what,
you're aware there's flight simulators, of course, right?
Yes.
Everybody knows there's flight simulators. There's flight simulator computer programs, and there's also full-on flight simulators.
Yeah.
They actually have air traffic control simulators that are crazy advanced. They have all the little airplanes on there. You have all your screens. You have a simulation of the visuals, and students, in a lot of cases, have to not only pass the written test and all these things, then they have to go to a simulator and actually practice the call signs and call in the numbers.
So I have a very interesting story. In October of 2015, I had the opportunity, me and a buddy of mine named Josiah, shout out to Josiah, we were on a business trip, and we actually had there is a flight simulator. The simulator itself cost $44 million.
Whoa, yeah. That's a lot of money.
It's actually registered with the FAA as an actual plane. That's how much of a simulator it is.
It doesn't fly. It's a simulator.
Doesn't fly. It's a simulator.
That is so weird.
It's about 2 stories tall, and it's the full size of a 757.
2 stories?
2 stories tall. And so we were offered the, if you guys would like the opportunity to fly this. And so he sat down as So he sat down as the pilot. I sat down as the co. And they said, we were actually trying to close a sales deal. And they said, if you can do this, we will buy your product.
Wow.
And so we both looked at each other and we said, we're going to do this. So they wanted us to take off from San Francisco and fly the 757 under the Golden Gate Bridge. And when you look at all the pictures, I have pictures on my phone. When you look at the pictures, it is an exact replica of everything you're doing. It looks just like you're looking out the window. And so we took off from SFO and flew it under the Golden Gate. and then came back into SFO and landed. And when we landed, there was about 5 guys in the cockpit besides the 2 of us.
Oh, observing the simulation?
Observing the simulation, just like they would, because this simulator is for training commercial pilots. And so they have air traffic control, everything going. And so as we're listening to that, doing all of that, we successfully took off, successfully flew under the Golden Gate, successfully landed. And when we got done, the other 5 guys that were sitting there just started clapping their hands and semi-cheering, not cheering, but very ecstatic about what we had done. And we were kind of like, we didn't know what we had done. And they said over 50% of trained, certified commercial pilots could not do what the 2 of you just did.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so we were pretty excited. And then we asked to do takeoff from JFK.
Well, did you make the sale?
No.
Oh.
Well, we kind of did, but they weren't true to their word. But hey, it was a great opportunity. So yeah, it's fun, and people can. There is a lot of simulations and stuff like that, and it is a training experience and very unique.
Yeah, there was one other quick story. Did you ever hear about the mechanic that stole an airliner?
No, I don't think so.
This mechanic just one day gets on the airliner and just takes off. He takes off, and then they're radioing him. They scramble to intercept this guy. What are you doing? And he finally says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I don't want to cause any trouble. I'm a broken man. I'm a messed up man." He's 29 years old. He said, "I don't want to hurt anybody, but I wasn't really planning on landing this thing. I know you guys are trying to direct me to land. I just don't want to land." He says, "But I'm going to do some maneuvers and flips." And they said, "What are you going to do?" And he starts doing backflips and barrel rolls.
Oh, my goodness.
Aileron rolls, I guess they're called.
Yeah.
And he successfully pulls them off.
Oh,
and
wow.
people say, there was this pilot, that's instructor, he said, watching those maneuvers, it's hard to believe he had never had training. The guy says, "Well, I played some video games, so I kind of know what I'm doing." And he just does these rolls, and the pilot instructor says he expertly executed them. He says, if you try to do something like that, typically in an airliner, you're going to tear their wings off, you're going to stall. They're not made to do that. And this kid, I think he's 28, 29. I say he's a kid, he's my age, 28. Yeah. So he pulls off these rolls and these backflips expertly executed.
Wait, we're talking about in a commercial airline.
Commercial airline.
Oh, wow. But, okay, so did he survive? Did he live? What?
The plane was a Q400, which is a dual turboprop airliner. So, commercial airliner.
Commercial airline, I know, shout out to Alaska Airlines. They fly the Q400s.
Yes. Definitely not designed to do what he did with it, but he was able to pull it off. It's really sad. It's funny how he's able to do those things.
Yes.
But it's just a really sad ordeal. He was obviously mentally ill or something. And then he went on. He said, "I'm not going to go land. I'm not going to try to land." They said, "No, you need to land or you're going to be all right." He says, "No, they're going to shoot me down." It's like, "Sir, we're not going to shoot you down. We just need you to land." And then he says, I want to fly over to the Olympics. So it's probably not a good idea. And he said something else about, "Oh, do you think Alaskan Airlines would give me a job if I land this thing?" And the controller says, "Sir, I think you can get a job pretty much doing anything if you can pull this off." Because they knew it was going to be very difficult for this guy with absolutely no understanding other than the video games.
Yes.
How to fly. But unfortunately, he just flew off into the distance, got away from civilization, and then crashed the plane.
That is too bad.
And of course perished in the crash. Yes. Really sad story, but it's really crazy how a mechanic was able to take off.
Yes. And now, where did he take off? I mean,
it was in Seattle.
Okay, he took off from Seattle. The fact that he knew enough of the jargon to...
No, he just started taking off. He just got on the thing, started up the engines. How he started up the engines, I don't know. He knew the startup sequence, apparently, because he was a mechanic and worked on them. Maybe he spun up the engines to work on them. Well, he started up the engines but never released the brake. And one of the pilots radio into the tower says, "Hey, there's a plane here trying to take off with his tires all locked up. They're all just smoking." So he took off with just straight up smoking all of his tires. And that was the first indication that something was wrong. And they radioed to him, "Hey, you're not clear for takeoff, not clear for takeoff." And it took about 45 minutes when they intercepted him.
Wow. You would think, because I can't even imagine being in the air traffic controller's place and what all was going through their mind as they tried to talk this guy down. You got to be a psychologist.
He remained very calm, and it was just, it was funny when he mentioned those roles and stuff, but it was all around sad. But it was just something that you don't expect. I would never expect that to happen. I remember this happening, and I had texted a friend of mine, Paul. He was training to be a pilot, and I said, "Hey, did you hear the story?" He says, "No," and I sent him the article. And I thought, that is crazy, but it's sad, but it's crazy.
It is sad.
He pulled that off. especially those maneuvers.
It's incredible.
Since he was a pilot, he understood the maneuvers and how difficult it would be, and how
Paul did. Yes,
those planes shouldn't be able to do that.
That's crazy.
But this guy my age, expertly executed him.
Kid, no, I'm teasing.
This 20-year-old kid.
So, well, I think that's all we have.
That's all I got too. Yeah. Well, that was fun, guys. Let us know what you think. Don't forget to send us an email at thegabelpodcast@gmail.com. That's THEGABL podcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. We love to hear from you. Don't forget the show suggestions. We love hearing the show suggestions as well.
And, while you're doing that, I do have one quick shout out. Today, we're recording in the studio. It's June 6th, and I would like to give a shout out to all of our veterans, especially the ones from World War II who participated in D-Day.
Yes.
I was thinking about that today on the drive in, and shout out June 6, 1944, D-Day, and to all of our veterans, we want to say thank you.
The bravery will never be forgotten.
It will never be forgotten. Yes, what a day. So, anyways, continuing on. Sorry to interrupt the.
Well, I gave the email. We love your feedback. Let us know your show suggestions or your questions, in fact. And yeah, we love to hear from you, and we look forward to answering your questions on the podcast.
Yes, we do.
Before we go, we're going to answer a couple questions from you guys. Let's see here. How long are you in the studio for each episode?
Oh, that's a good question.
I would say, 20 minutes more than an episode?
Yeah, so whatever the episode is, plus 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah,
so about an hour, I would assume.
Yeah,
because
generally an hour.
We kind of get set up and we hit record and we do our tests, and it's about an hour.
Yeah, we're just testing our audio equipment, etc. So yeah.
Do you have experience in radio before beginning podcasting?
Ooh, do you?
No, I do not. This is
not.
the first thing I'm doing for voice. No, actually, that's not true. I did some volunteer voiceover work for quite a bit of time.
Okay.
But nothing professional.
In radio professionally as far as broadcasting.
How about you?
I don't have a ton of experience, but have been interviewed on the radio multiple times and been in studio at least once.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes, but other than that, I haven't.
But never like a daily thing.
No.
I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah,
here.
probably.
How long does it take you to research for each episode?
Ooh, that varies.
So that's an interesting question. So we picked the topics from your suggestions. Email us at thegabelpodcast@gmail.com for your suggestions.
Out.
And I would say about a week. We select them a week in advance, and that's when we really start to drill them down. And
well, yeah, we select them
a week in advance, and then.
Well, we select them about a month in advance as far as we set the show schedule. Mm-hmm. But then about a week in advance is when we really start kind of
focusing on
down.
one topic.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, drilling down and then how much time does it actually take? It varies by topic, anywhere from a couple of hours to it can take up to probably 20 to 30 hours if the right topic.
Yeah.
So.
Well, cool. Well, let's answer some more questions next week, guys. Don't forget to submit your questions, and we'll talk to you next time.
Adios.